The station was quiet, as it always was at the edge of human space. A lone outpost hung above a barren moon, its metal walls creaking with age and long hours of silence. Tomasz lived there, maintaining ships that passed through. Most days were the same. A trader would arrive, sometimes a survey craft, sometimes a freighter with a broken engine. He would fix their problems, collect a few credits, and watch them leave again. The cycle repeated without end. Tomasz had chosen this life because it was simple. He liked machines more than crowds. Ships did not argue or complain. They only broke down and waited for someone with steady hands to repair them. That was what Tomasz provided. Still, the loneliness weighed on him at times. He often found himself looking out the window, staring at the stars, and wondering if there was more waiting out there. On one of those long evenings, the scanner lit up with a faint signal. At first, Tomasz thought it was a mistake. The signal was weak, as though the source was drifting without power. Curious, he adjusted the receiver and soon saw the outline of a damaged shuttle moving slowly through the void. Its hull was scarred, its lights dead, and its course random. It looked abandoned. Tomasz considered leaving it alone. Derelicts often carried nothing but trouble. Still, something inside him urged him to investigate. He powered up his small tug and moved out to intercept. As the shuttle grew larger in his view, he saw how badly it was damaged. Panels were torn away, wires hung loose, and the engine was almost gone. It should not have been flying at all. He docked with care and forced open the hatch. The air inside was thin and stale, but still breathable. The cabin was dark, with only the faint glow of backup systems. Tomasz moved slowly, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. He expected to find empty seats and broken controls. Instead, he saw a figure slumped against the wall. It was a woman. For a moment Tomasz froze. He had not expected to find anyone alive. She was young, with long dark hair falling over her shoulders and strange markings running along her arms. Her skin was pale, and her breathing shallow, but she was alive. She stirred weakly when the light touched her face, her eyes half opening. Tomasz dropped to his knees and checked her pulse. It was faint but steady. He quickly pulled a small oxygen mask from his kit and placed it over her mouth. The woman tried to speak, but the words came out in a language he did not understand. Her voice was soft and broken, yet filled with determination. "Easy," Tomasz said gently. "You are safe now." She did not understand, but she calmed slightly, as though sensing his tone. Tomasz lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt, and carried her back to his tug. Once aboard, he sealed the hatch and returned to the station. Inside the medical bay, he laid her down and began checking her condition. She had no obvious wounds, but her body was weak from hunger and exhaustion. He gave her water, and she drank slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. For the first time in a long while, Tomasz felt nervous. He was used to dealing with machines, not people. He had no idea who she was or why she was drifting alone in a broken shuttle. Yet there was something about her presence that filled the room. She had a soft natural beauty, not in a way that demanded attention but in a way that felt calm and human despite the strange markings. Hours passed as Tomasz worked to stabilize her. She slept for long stretches, waking only to take a little food or water. Each time her eyes opened, she seemed more aware, as though trying to piece together where she was. She attempted to speak again, but the words still made no sense. Tomasz could only shake his head and smile, hoping she understood his kindness. Later, As he sat by her side, Tomasz wondered about her markings. They were not tattoos but something deeper, like faint glowing lines carved into her skin. They looked almost alive in the dim light. He had never seen anything like them, not in all the travelers and traders who had passed through the station. Whoever she was not ordinary. When she finally managed to say a single word he could understand, Tomasz leaned forward in surprise. "Lyra," she whispered, tapping her chest. Her voice was weak, but her eyes held steady on his. "Lyra," Tomasz repeated, pointing at her. She nodded slowly. It was a small breakthrough, yet it felt like a bridge between two distant worlds. From that moment, the station no longer felt so silent. There was a presence now, a reminder that the stars did not only carry machines and broken ships, but also lives filled with mystery and meaning. Tomasz did not know where Lyra came from or what story had left her adrift. He only knew he had found her, and she had survived. For now, that was enough. As the station settled into the quiet hum of night, Tomasz glanced at the stars outside. The discovery had changed something inside him. He could sense it. Life at the edge of human space was no longer simple. The silence had been broken by a whisper of another world, and it had come in the form of a single woman with eyes that carried secrets he could not yet imagine. The station had always been a place of steady silence. The hum of machines was Tomasz's only company. But now that silence had shifted. There was another presence moving through the narrow halls, and it changed everything. Lyra, as she had named herself, was no longer lying weak in the medical bay. She had regained some strength, though she still walked slowly and carefully. Tomasz had given her one of his old shirts and trousers, simple and plain, but she wore them with a quiet dignity that surprised him. She moved like someone who had known hardship yet carried herself with calm pride. Communication between them remained difficult. Lyra spoke in short words from her own language, and Tomasz tried to respond with gestures and simple sounds. It was clumsy at first, but slowly they built a rhythm. When she wanted water, she would point at the cup and say a soft sound. When Tomasz wanted her to rest, he would motion with his hands, and she would smile faintly in understanding. Despite the language barrier, Tomasz began to notice the small details about her. She studied everything with intense curiosity. When he repaired a console, she stood nearby, watching his every move. Her eyes followed the wires, the sparks, the steady motion of his tools. When he cooked a simple meal, she leaned forward to watch how the food changed in the pan. She touched the station walls as though learning their texture, as though even metal held secrets for her. Tomasz found her presence both unsettling and comforting. He was used to silence, to days where no one spoke his name. Now, even without words, he felt seen. Her soft gaze made the station feel alive in a way he had forgotten. One evening, after giving her a warm meal, Tomasz sat across from her at the small table. She ate slowly, carefully, as if food was something precious. When she finished, she looked at him and tapped her chest again. "Lyra," she said. Tomasz nodded, smiling. "Lyra." Then he pointed at himself. "Tomasz." Her lips curved slightly. "Moss." The sound of his name spoken by her voice startled him. For years no one had said it with such care. She repeated it again, a little stronger, and her eyes lit up when he nodded in approval. A bridge was forming between them, word by word. Days passed in this quiet rhythm. Lyra recovered more, and Tomasz noticed her natural strength beneath the fragile appearance. She began helping with small tasks around the station. When he carried heavy tools, she would insist on taking part of the load. When he cleaned filters, she knelt beside him, watching and copying his movements. She was learning quickly, as though her mind absorbed every detail without effort. Still, questions filled Tamash's thoughts. Who was she? What did the strange markings on her arms mean? Why had she been drifting alone in a broken shuttle? He wanted to ask, but their words were too few. The answers remained locked inside her eyes. One night, the power grid on the outer deck failed. Tamash grabbed his tools and hurried to the sector. To his surprise, Lyra followed. She stood beside him as he worked in the dim emergency lights. At first, he tried to send her back, but she shook her head firmly. She would not leave. As he worked, she watched every detail. When a spark shot out, she reached forward and touched a cable with her bare hand. Tamash gasped, ready to pull her away, but then froze. The markings on her arm glowed faintly, and the current seemed to bend. The broken connection flickered back to life, as though her touch had completed the circuit. Tamash stared, speechless. Lyra withdrew her hand slowly, the glow fading. She looked at him with quiet eyes, as if asking him not to fear her. He did not move for a long moment. His heart raced, not from fear, but from wonder. Machines had been his only friends. He knew their rules, their limits. But Lyra had just broken those rules with ease, using nothing but her own body. She was not an ordinary traveler. That night, Tamash could not sleep. He sat in the control room, staring at the stars, while Lyra rested in her quarters. His mind turned again and again to what he had seen. If she could bend energy, what else could she do? What kind of people had markings like hers? The answer came in the quietest way. The next morning, Lyra entered the control room while Tamash was checking signals. She held a piece of metal scrap in her hand. Without a word, she set it on the table, closed her eyes, and placed her palm over it. The markings lit again. The scrap bent and reshaped itself slowly, curling into the shape of a small flower. When she opened her eyes, she pushed it toward him with a small smile. Tamash touched the metal flower gently. It was warm, perfectly shaped, something no simple tool could have done in seconds. "You made this," Tamash whispered, knowing she would not understand the words, but saying them anyway. Lyra only nodded, her eyes soft. She lifted her hand to her chest again. "Lyra." Then she touched the flower. He realized she was trying to explain, to show him who she was in the only way she could. The markings were not random. They were part of her, part of what made her different. From that day, Tamash no longer thought of her as a guest. She was a mystery, yes, but also a companion. He began teaching her words in his language, pointing at things and speaking slowly. She repeated after him, her voice growing stronger each time. Water. Food. Ship. Friend. That last word made her pause. She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. Then she repeated softly, friend. Tamash felt something stir in his chest, something he had not felt in many years. The loneliness that had haunted him seemed to fade, replaced by the simple truth of that word. The station was no longer silent. The silent guest had become part of his days, and though questions remained, Tamash felt certain of one thing. Meeting Lyra was no accident. The stars had carried her to him for a reason, even if he could not yet see it. And deep inside, he sensed that her story was only beginning. Life on the station slowly settled into a new rhythm. Tomasz repaired passing ships as always, but now there was Lyra. She had become part of every day, learning his words, helping with small tasks, and watching the stars through the wide glass windows. Though her language was still limited, she smiled more, and Tomasz began to feel as though the silence of the outpost had finally lifted. One evening, while checking the scanners, Tomasz noticed a signal. At first, he thought it was another freighter or patrol ship. Traffic was rare in this part of space, but not impossible. He leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowing. The ship was small, not much larger than the shuttle Lyra had arrived in, but its signal was steady. It was heading straight for the station. Tomasz felt unease stir in his chest. He glanced at Lyra, who sat nearby studying a book of simple words he had written for her. She sensed his concern and came closer, peering at the display. The moment her eyes fell on the signal, her expression changed. She stiffened, her lips parting in silent recognition. "You know them," Tomasz said, though he knew she might not understand. Her hands trembled slightly. Then, as if gathering her strength, she nodded. The ship drew nearer. Tomasz debated whether to send a warning or to remain silent. He had no weapons on the station, only basic defenses. If these newcomers meant harm, he could do little to stop them. Yet when the ship finally docked, the hatch opened calmly, without force. 3 figures stepped out. Tomasz's breath caught. They were women, each with the same strange markings on their arms, the same calm beauty in their faces. They looked almost identical to Lyra, as though they could be her reflections. Their movements were steady, their eyes sharp and searching. Lyra gasped softly. She hurried forward, her hands trembling as she spoke quickly in her language. The newcomers answered at once, their voices flowing like a river. Though Tomasz understood none of it, the emotion was clear. Relief. Joy. They embraced her one by one, holding her close as though she had been lost for years. Tears shone in their eyes. Tomasz stood back, watching in silence. For the first time since he had found her, Lyra seemed complete. She was no longer a lone figure drifting in space. She was part of something larger, something Tomasz could not yet name. When at last the greetings ended, the 3 women turned their attention to Tomasz. Their gazes were sharp but not hostile. One of them stepped forward and placed a hand over her chest. She spoke a word slowly, as though offering her name. Then the others followed, giving their names as well. Tomasz repeated them clumsily, earning faint nods of approval. They seemed to recognize his kindness. Lyra touched his arm gently and spoke a single word in his language. Friend. The sisters looked at her, then at Tomasz, and their expressions softened. Despite the moment of peace, Tomasz felt the weight of something unspoken. The sisters carried themselves with urgency, as though time pressed on them. Their eyes moved often to the stars outside, and when they spoke among themselves, their voices grew heavy with concern. Later, while they sat together in the common room, one of the sisters produced a small device from her satchel. She set it on the table, and with a flicker of light, a projection appeared. It showed stars and paths traced through them. Tomasz leaned forward, realizing it was a map. The woman pointed at a cluster of glowing points, then swept her hand across, showing a dark shape that spread outward like a shadow. Her voice grew firm as she explained, though Tomasz could not understand the words. Still, the meaning was clear enough. Something was spreading across space, chasing them, forcing them to run. Lyra looked at Tomasz then, her eyes pleading. She placed her hand on his, repeating softly, Friend. Help. Tamash's heart tightened. He was a mechanic, not a leader or fighter. Yet here sat four sisters who had traveled across the stars seeking safety, and fate had brought them to his lonely station. That night, sleep did not come easily. Tamash walked the narrow halls of the station, hearing echoes of voices that were not his own. The sisters had brought both warmth and a storm into his quiet life. Their arrival meant change, and change was something he had long avoided. But he could not ignore the truth. Lyra had trusted him, and now her sisters did as well. He had rescued one, but now he felt as though he had inherited them all, their story, their hope, and their fear. The following day, he found the sisters working quietly with Lyra. They were repairing her damaged shuttle, using tools with surprising skill. One of them even adjusted the circuits with her bare hands, the markings on her skin glowing faintly. Tamash watched in awe. Their abilities were not limited to Lyra alone. They all carried that strange gift. When they noticed his presence, one of the sisters gestured for him to join. She pointed at the open panels of the shuttle and spoke slowly, using both words and signs. Tamash understood the message. They were asking for his help. Together they worked through the day, and though words were few, the connection grew stronger. Tamash showed them how to use his tools, and they showed him a glimpse of their abilities. By the end of the day, the shuttle was whole again, though the atmosphere of unease remained. As the stars filled the sky outside, Tamash knew one thing for certain. Their arrival was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The sisters had found their way to him for a reason, and that reason would soon reveal itself. The silence of the station had been broken, and Tamash's life was no longer his own. The arrival of Lyra's sisters had brought choice, and with it, a path that would lead beyond anything he had ever imagined. The station felt different with four new voices echoing through its narrow halls. Tamash, who had once lived in silence, now found himself surrounded by quiet conversation, gentle footsteps, and the sound of people moving with purpose. Lyra and her sisters had made the outpost feel alive in a way he had never imagined. Yet under that warmth, there was a constant shadow. The sisters carried more than reunion. They carried urgency, as though every smile was weighed down by something unseen. One evening, the sisters gathered around the table in the common room. The station's dim lights cast long shadows over their faces. Tamash sat with them, unsure of what was to come. Lyra placed her hand on his arm, her eyes steady. She spoke his name softly, then gestured to her sisters. They nodded in turn. One of them brought out the small device again, the same one that had projected the map earlier. She placed it on the table, and with a quiet hum, the stars appeared once more. Tamash leaned forward, watching as the glowing points shifted and spread across the space before them. The woman pointed at a cluster of stars, then at a dark wave creeping across the map. She spoke in her own language, her tone sharp and urgent. Tamash could not understand the words, but the meaning grew clear. Something was spreading across their home, chasing them, forcing them to flee. Another sister leaned forward and touched the map, highlighting several points where human colonies lay. Her eyes lifted to Tamash, filled with quiet question. Lyra, sitting close to him, whispered in his language, slow and careful. Friend. Help. Tamash felt his chest tighten. The sisters were not simply here to find Lyra. They were here for something greater. They were asking for more than shelter. They were asking for humanity's choice. He sat back, rubbing his hand across his face. I am no leader, he murmured. I am only a mechanic. The sisters did not understand his words, but they seemed to read his hesitation. One of them leaned forward, placing her hand over his on the table. Her touch was firm, her eyes steady. Without words, she was telling him this was not about being a leader. It was about being human. Tomasz thought of his life before. Days filled with the sound of tools, the hum of broken engines, the silence of a lonely station. It had been simple, safe, and small. But Lyra's arrival had changed that forever. Her sister's presence now pushed the change even further. He had rescued one, but now they stood before him asking for something larger than himself. That night, Tomasz could not sleep. He walked the narrow corridors of the station, the weight of their request heavy on his mind. He paused at the wide window, staring out at the endless stars. What could one man do against something that spread across worlds? Yet deep inside, another voice whispered humanity had always risen when challenged. Even in the darkest times, they had found a way forward. The next morning, he found Lyra in the workshop. She was holding one of his tools, turning it carefully in her hands as though studying its purpose. When she saw him, she smiled faintly. "Tomasz," she said softly, her voice stronger now with each word she learned. Then she placed her hand on her chest. "Lyra." She pointed toward the stars outside, her eyes serious. "Home. Gone." Her voice shook slightly as she spoke, but her meaning was clear. Then she reached forward, gently taking his hand. "Friend. Choice." Tomasz felt his throat tighten. She was asking him not just as a stranger, but as someone who had become part of his life. He looked at her and realized the truth. This was no longer about whether he could help. It was about whether humanity should stand aside or step forward. Later that day, the sisters gathered again. Tomasz took a deep breath and spoke slowly, choosing words Lyra could understand. "I will help. I will tell my people. They must know." Lyra's eyes filled with quiet relief. She repeated his words softly, then translated to her sisters. Their faces lit with hope. But Tomasz knew this choice would not be simple. Humans were cautious, especially when it came to strangers. Many would hesitate to stand beside a people they did not know. Still, he also knew humanity had a spirit that thrived in challenge. If the sisters carried both danger and hope, then perhaps humans were meant to stand with them. Over the following days, Tomasz prepared his station for a message. He repaired the long-range transmitters, cleaned the consoles, and recalibrated the signal strength. Lyra and her sisters watched closely, sometimes helping, sometimes standing silently as though sensing the importance of his task. When the system was ready, Tomasz sat before the transmitter. His hands hovered over the controls, his heart pounding. He was about to send a message that could change everything. He pressed the key and spoke. His voice carried through the empty room, clear and steady. "This is Tomasz, mechanic at Outpost 7. I have found survivors from beyond our colonies. They carry warning of a shadow that spreads across their home. They ask for help. I ask for help. Humanity must decide. Will we close our doors, or will we open them?" He released the key and sat back, his chest tight. The message was short, but it was all he could offer. Now, the choice would ripple beyond him. Behind him, Lyra and her sisters stood together. They said nothing, but their eyes told him they understood. He had opened the door. That night, the station was filled with a silence different from the one before. It was no longer empty silence. It was waiting silence. A silence filled with the weight of a choice that would not only shape Tamash's life, but perhaps the path of all humanity. For Tamash, the decision had already been made. He had chosen to stand beside them. What humanity chose, he did not yet know. But he knew this: the stars no longer held only machines and emptiness. They now held a future built on connection, trust, and a decision that would test the heart of every human alive. And so the sisters' question lingered in the air like the hum of the station itself. A choice had been presented, and the answer would come soon. The message Tamash sent traveled across the stars, carried by relay stations and old communication towers that had not been used in years. Once spoken, his words could not be taken back. Now all he could do was wait. The waiting felt heavier than anything he had ever known. Each morning, Tamash woke and checked the signal logs, hoping for a reply. Each evening, he sat by the wide window, his eyes on the stars, wondering if anyone had heard. The silence pressed on him, deeper than before. Lyra and her sisters sensed his unease. They moved through the station quietly, helping where they could, but their eyes often followed Tamash with understanding. They knew the weight of choice. They had carried it for far longer than he had. One night, Lyra found him in the workshop. He was sitting at the bench, his hands still, his tools untouched. The air smelled of oil and metal, but his mind was far away. She walked to him and placed a small piece of scrap metal on the table. With slow care, she shaped it again with her glowing hands, bending it into the form of a star. She pushed it toward him and said softly, "Hope." Tamash stared at the little star. The word felt heavy and light all at once. He wanted to believe in it, but doubt pulled at him. He looked at her and whispered, "What if they say no?" She did not understand the words fully, but she read his expression. Her hand touched his chest, just above his heart. Then she spoke a single word, steady and calm. "Friend." It was her answer. Even if the world turned away, she trusted him. The next day brought the first reply. The transmitter crackled, and Tamash rushed to the console. A voice filled the room, an officer from a nearby colony. The words were careful, measured. They had heard his message, but they wanted proof. Who were these sisters? Why should humanity trust them? Tamash's throat felt dry as he listened. Proof. Evidence. Assurance. The officer wanted answers he could not give. All Tamash had were his own eyes, his own experience. He looked back at Lyra and her sisters, standing silently behind him, their faces calm but hopeful. He knew he had to speak. "This is not a trick," Tamash said into the transmitter. "I have lived alone on this station for years. I know the stars and I know machines. These sisters are not like anyone I have ever met. They carry something inside them, something real. I cannot explain it fully, but I believe them. And I ask you to believe them too." His voice cracked at the end, but he pressed the key firmly. The words were sent. More days passed. More voices answered. Some were curious, some suspicious, and some afraid. Tamash listened to them all. Some asked if the sisters were dangerous. Others feared bringing unknown people into human space. A few, however, spoke with quiet excitement. They believed this might be a chance to grow, to learn, to stand beside another people. Each night, Tamash wrestled with the weight of it all. He was just a mechanic, a man who fixed broken ships. Why had the choice fallen to him? Why had fate brought Lyra to his small outpost, and why had her sisters come knocking on his door? He felt too small for such a burden. Yet when he thought of ignoring them, of sending them away, his heart grew heavy. He remembered the broken shuttle drifting in silence. He remembered Lyra's weak voice as she whispered her name. He remembered her hand shaping a flower from scrap metal, her eyes glowing with quiet trust. If he had turned away that day, she would not be here now. If he turned away today, what future would be lost? The dilemma burned inside him. Was it right to pull humanity into a struggle that was not theirs? Was it right to ask colonies to risk safety for strangers? But was it not also human nature to reach out, to help, to build connections beyond fear? One evening, while the sisters rested, Tomasz walked alone to the observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly before him, each point a possible world, a possible story. He thought of Earth, though he had never been there. He thought of all the times humanity had stepped into the unknown, daring to go further than safety allowed. That daring spirit was what had carried them into space in the first place. Perhaps this was not a burden. Perhaps it was an invitation. Behind him, a soft sound stirred. Lyra had followed him. She stood quietly at his side, her eyes also on the stars. For a long time, neither spoke. Then, slowly, she said a single phrase in his language. "Together strong." Tomasz turned to her, surprised. The words were halting, but they carried meaning beyond their sound. Together strong. Not alone. Not divided. That was the heart of her plea. He looked back at the stars and felt the weight of his dilemma ease slightly. The choice was not his alone. Humanity would choose, one voice at a time. His role was only to keep the door open, to remind them of what was possible. The next morning, Tomasz returned to the transmitter with renewed strength. He sent another message, this time not to one colony, but to all who could hear. His words were simple, but his voice was firm. We have been given a choice. To close our doors or to open them. To let fear guide us or to let hope guide us. I have seen these sisters, and I know they are not our enemy. They are people, like us, searching for safety. I believe we are meant to stand with them. I ask you to believe too. Humanity has always been strongest when we are not alone. The choice is ours now. When he released the key, his hands shook, but his heart felt steady. He had spoken the truth as he saw it. That night, as he sat with Lyra and her sisters, the air on the station felt lighter. They laughed softly together, sharing food and simple words. The sisters still carried the weight of their past, but now there was also a spark of hope in their eyes. Tomasz still did not know what humanity would decide. The dilemma remained, but he had accepted it. He no longer saw himself as only a mechanic. He was part of something greater now, something that reached beyond the walls of his station and into the heart of humanity itself. And though the future was uncertain, one thing was clear. Whatever choice was made, it would change the stars forever. For many days the station lived in a rhythm of waiting. The message Tomasz had sent traveled far, crossing colonies, outposts, and listening posts. The replies came slowly at first, then in greater number. Each new signal brought fresh voices into the air, carrying hope, fear, doubt, and curiosity. Tomasz listened to them all. Some messages were brief, asking for proof. Some were long, filled with questions about the sisters' origin, their gifts, and their purpose. A few messages, however, spoke with warmth. They said humanity had always been stronger when it reached beyond itself. They said perhaps this meeting was no accident. The station became a place of gathering even though no ship had yet arrived. Through sound alone, the voices of human colonies began to weave together. Lyra and her sisters listened with quiet attention, though they understood only fragments. They could sense the mood in the voices even when the words were unclear. Hope rose, but hesitation also lingered. One evening, Tomasz received a message from a council on a nearby colony. The voice of the speaker was calm and measured. "We have heard your words, Tomasz. We cannot ignore them. If what you say is true, then we stand at a turning point. Some among us wish to remain apart. Some wish to reach out. We ask for time to decide." Tomasz understood. Humanity did not move as one mind. It was a collection of many voices, each carrying its own fears and dreams. The decision would not come in a single moment, but in the slow gathering of courage. While they waited, the sisters continued to show their gifts. They repaired broken circuits with only a touch. They shaped scrap metal into small symbols, leaving them on the tables and shelves of the station as quiet reminders of their presence. Sometimes they sat with Tomasz in the workshop, learning words from him as he worked. The walls of the outpost, once silent and empty, now felt alive with possibility. Then, one morning, the silence broke. The transmitter lit up with a priority signal. Tomasz leaned forward, his heart racing. The voice that came through was strong, steady, and carried the weight of many behind it. "This is Council of Meridian Colony. We have listened. We have debated. We have decided. Humanity will not turn away. We will stand with those who come to us in need. Prepare to receive aid." Tomasz sat frozen. For a moment, he could not breathe. The choice had been made. Humanity had given its answer. Lyra, standing close behind him, touched his shoulder. "Yes," she asked, her voice hopeful. Tomasz turned, his face breaking into a rare smile. "Yes," he whispered. They said yes. She did not understand every word, but she saw the truth in his eyes. She called softly to her sisters, and they gathered quickly. Tomasz repeated the word again, louder, for them all. "Yes." The sisters embraced each other, their faces filled with relief. Their journey, their fear, their endless running now, at last, it had found an answer. They were no longer alone. In the days that followed, more signals arrived. Other colonies added their voices, some with cautious agreement, some with enthusiastic support. Plans were made. Ships would be sent, not only to Tomasz's outpost but to other stations as well. Humanity would not wait for shadows to reach their doors. They would move forward, together. The first ship arrived 2 weeks later. It was not a warship but a carrier filled with supplies, translators, and engineers. When it docked with the station, Tomasz felt his chest tighten. He had grown used to solitude, but now the station doors opened to a flow of people. They stepped inside with curious eyes, glancing at Lyra and her sisters with wonder and respect. The engineers set to work expanding the communication systems. Translators began learning the sisters' language, building bridges of sound and meaning. And for the first time, Lyra spoke with humans beyond Tomasz. Her words were halting, but her meaning was clear: gratitude. Tomasz stood back, watching the outpost transform. What had once been a lonely mechanics station was becoming the first meeting place between two peoples. He felt both pride and disbelief. One evening, after the visitors had returned to their ship, Tomasz walked to the observation deck. Lyra joined him, standing quietly by his side. The stars stretched out before them, as endless as always, but now they felt different. They were no longer only points of light in an empty sky. They were paths, connections waiting to be made. "You opened door," Lyra said softly, her words slow but sure. Tomasz looked at her, surprised. She had spoken in his language with clarity he had not expected. "You opened door," she repeated, her eyes steady. "Now many walk through." Her words carried truth. Tomasz had not done it alone, but he had been the first to turn the lock. He had chosen to believe, and that choice had spread outward, changing the course of countless lives. For the first time in years, Tomasz did not feel like only a mechanic. He felt like part of something greater. Humanity's answer had not only changed the sisters' future. It had changed his own. The days ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and dangers. But Tomasz no longer feared them. Humanity had chosen connection over fear, and that choice was stronger than any shadow. As the station lights dimmed for the night, Tomasz stood with Lyra and her sisters at the window. Together they looked at the stars, no longer as strangers, but as companions beginning a shared journey. The answer had been given, and it was clear. Humanity had said yes. The station no longer felt like a quiet corner of forgotten space. Where once there had been silence, now there was life. The docking bays were busy with visitors. Engineers moved in and out with tools, translators tested their devices, and couriers carried messages between colonies. The outpost had become something Tomasz never expected: a bridge. Tomasz walked the halls each morning, still in his work clothes, still carrying his tools, but now people nodded to him as they passed. Some even stopped to ask for help or guidance. It felt strange. For so long, no one had spoken his name but the empty walls. Now it was spoken every day. The sisters moved among the visitors with quiet grace. Lyra and her sisters were not loud or demanding. They listened, they learned, and they offered their gifts carefully. When a power grid overloaded, one sister touched the circuits and brought them back to life. When a broken part seemed useless, another shaped it into something new. Slowly, the humans saw not just mystery in the sisters, but trust. One evening, the council delegates from Meridian arrived. They were leaders chosen to see for themselves the truth of what Tomasz had spoken. They asked questions, studied the records, and even spoke with Lyra through the translators. She answered as best she could, her words still slow but honest. After many hours, the delegates gathered with Tomasz in the meeting hall. The oldest among them, a man with kind but sharp eyes, looked at him and said, "You were the first to see them as more than shadows. You chose to open the door. Because of that, we now see a path we did not before. Humanity will honor this choice. We will walk beside them." Tomasz felt the weight of those words. It was more than agreement. It was a promise. The decision spread quickly. Colonies began sending not only supplies but also people, teachers, builders, and explorers. They wanted to learn from the sisters, and they wanted to share in return. Plans were drawn for a new place, not just a station but a shared settlement where both peoples could live and work together. When Tomasz first heard of it, he thought they would choose a great city or a rich world. But the council surprised him. They asked if his station could become the foundation. They said it was fitting, for this was where the story began. Tomasz looked around at the worn walls, the patched doors, the humming machines that he had kept alive with his own hands for years. It was not much compared to the wonders of the colonies. But when he thought of all that had happened here, Lyra's rescue, the arrival of her sisters, the first messages sent across the stars, he realized the council was right. This was the beginning. The work started quickly. More ships came, bringing materials to expand the station into something greater. Old sections were rebuilt, new wings were added, and fresh power systems were installed. What was once a lonely outpost became a place filled with light and movement. Tomasz often stood back, watching the changes with quiet amazement. He helped where he could, fixing what others overlooked, guiding workers through the hidden parts of the old structure. But he no longer felt alone in his task. Many hands now worked beside his. The sisters watched the building with wonder. To them, it was more than construction. It was healing. They had carried loss for so long, drifting from place to place. Now, for the first time, they saw a future being built brick by brick, wire by wire. Sometimes they shaped small pieces of art from spare metal and left them in corners of the new halls: a flower, a star, a circle. These became symbols of hope, reminders that beauty could grow even in steel. As weeks turned to months, the settlement gained a name. The council called it Horizon Point, for it marked the edge of one story and the beginning of another. The name spread quickly, and soon everyone spoke it with pride. Horizon Point was no longer just a station. It was the first step of a shared journey. One evening, as construction slowed and the workers rested, Tomasz walked to the observation deck. He had made this walk many times before, but this time felt different. The deck was wider now, the glass stronger, and more people stood there looking at the stars. Yet he still found a quiet corner. Lyra joined him, as she often did. She stood beside him, her gaze steady on the endless sky. For a long moment, they said nothing. Then Lyra turned to him and spoke softly. "Not alone," she said. Tomasz nodded. "Not alone," he repeated. Her eyes shone with calm certainty. "Together," she added. "Together." The word carried weight. It was more than company. It was promise. It was the shape of the future. Tomasz thought back to the day he found her broken shuttle drifting in the dark. He remembered the silence of that moment, the uncertainty, the choice he made to open the hatch and pull her inside. At the time, it felt like a small act. Yet that small act had grown into this. It had become a spark that changed the course of countless lives. He smiled faintly. For so long he had called himself only a mechanic, a man who fixed what was broken. Now he saw that even a mechanic could change the stars. The sound of laughter carried across the deck. Workers and sisters sat together, sharing food, sharing stories, bridging languages one word at a time. Tomasz watched them and felt a warmth in his chest. The future would not be simple, but it would be shared. Later that night, when the stars were brightest, Tomasz sat at his workbench once more. The tools were familiar, the metal scraps the same, yet his hands moved differently. He shaped a small piece of metal into a star, just as Lyra once had. He placed it on the shelf, a reminder of how far they had come. The story of Horizon Point was only beginning, but its first chapter was written in clear letters. Humanity had chosen hope. The sisters had chosen trust. And together, they had chosen to build, not to fear. The stars beyond the window still stretched endless and unknown, but they no longer felt distant. They felt like doors waiting to be opened. And this time, Tomasz knew, humanity would not open them alone.